This week, some people are returning to their homes for the first time since the floods. They are finding extensive damage, and a lot of people still have questions on what help is available. I'm joined now by Matt Doherty. He is an owner and agent with State Farm Insurance. Thanks so much for coming in.
You bet.
Now, first of all, who is covered by insurance when it comes to flood damage?
Typically, flood damage is covered through FEMA. So FEMA has a program that is basically administered through the federal government. And the program is to help people, like in the cases we've seen here where the Platte River flooded and folks lost a lot of almost everything they had. And so they take a flood policy out to cover for some of the damages.
Now, we've been talking to some people who said, you know, I had flood insurance and still I haven't been covered in this situation. Why might that happen?
Those circumstances are pretty unique. The flood that we had was very devastating, and I'd have to see the situation. Sometimes it just depends on how the what we call peril or the loss happened. So in some cases where water might be seeping in through the basement, where it wasn't like standing water around the house or running water to the house, in those cases it could just be a fact of the ground so saturated, it's just not covered. In some cases it could be where, you know, I've heard, and I've got to dive into it because I don't understand exactly the language clearly there, but where there could have been like a breakage in like a dam or a dike, and sometimes when those happen, there might be some nuances to the coverage that may not cover them. One of the things to keep in mind, the flood coverage too, in terms of above grade, it does provide coverage, but for anything in the basements, it's pretty limited. So when you dive into the policy, it's not a lot of coverage for your things in the basement. So
when we're talking about items or structure, what are the types of things, I guess, that could be covered or would not be covered with a flood insurance policy, or does it vary too much?
It can vary because you can have that quoted specific to the policy. So you can have different limits for coverage A, which is, think of coverage A, permanent things, like if I lifted your house up and the things that didn't fall out, that would typically be like your coverage A, and the things that fall out would be your coverage B, like your personal property. And so you can fluctuate those through your agent for your flood policy.
Now, I understand if people want to apply for disaster assistance, they're supposed to go through the steps of actually going through insurance first. How does that process work?
Well, you just call your local carrier. So let's say, for example, you had home insurance with me and your house flooded, and you need to get some federal aid because the president came out and said we're going to consider this a disaster area and provide some federal aid. In order to qualify that, the way I understand it is, first you'd have to file a claim with me, your local carrier. I'd have to deny your claim. And then you go through the process. And once you go through that process, you'd be eligible, depending on like your income and other things, for that aid.
But you do actually have to go through that
Typically,
insurance step first. That is
your
important
local carrier,
to know.
right?
Sure.
So for the homeowner's insurance, let's say, or your renter's insurance, you would file that claim, and then that local carrier would come back and say we're denying that particular claim. So then you could file for the aid with the federal government.
Makes sense.
There's an application process.
Sure, you have that whole process to go through. Now, a lot of people, this affected thousands of people. Of course, a lot of people here weren't affected by the floods, but they've been watching and seeing what has happened. What is your advice moving forward to some folks, either if they had damage or they didn't have damage, but they've seen what water can do?
That's a great question. What we've asked everybody to do is try to get in front of your local insurance agent and sit down and talk about your coverage and kind of dive into that in more detail and kind of talk about where you're located. Are you near a waterway? There are some things you can do within your homeowner's policy or renter's insurance today that can protect you. Some of those little things are like a backup and sewer endorsement. It's limited in what it can do, but in this case, let me give you an example. If in the case where we saw the flooding happening, the sewer systems had ice and were damming up in some areas. And so the water was coming back up and coming up through those floor drains in the basements. And so if you would have had backup and sewer endorsement, you may have qualified for coverage for like your personal property, and sometimes, you know, depending on the endorsement, from $10,000 to $20,000 worth of protection to replace some of the coverage A that we were talking about earlier. So that's one way. But the most important thing I think for people to do is sit down with your insurance agent and really understand what you have first of all, and figure out if it's worth it for you to have that flood policy. I think the most important thing to do is just discuss it and then get a quote and figure out what the numbers look like.
You know, we've had reporters coming back and telling stories of, I talked to so-and-so who said they're not covered because of this, or their friend isn't covered because of this. And we keep hearing these stories adding up. And it does sound like the best piece of advice is find an insurance agent who will actually answer your questions. And right now, of course, they're dealing with a lot. You're dealing with a lot too, but you have to make sure that someone is going to be advocating for you a little bit too.
Yes, and I would say that ask your local agent if he's certified to provide flood insurance, because that'd be helpful, because then he can kind of balance what you have with your homeowner's coverage, let's say, and then also be able to go out and look at the flood coverage. I mean, we're familiar with it, and so we understand the program some, and so we can balance that and be able to say, okay, well, you know, Jen, it looks like you need homeowners insurance, but let's take a look at the home and see where you're located, and maybe see how much a flood insurance quote might cost you, and see if it makes sense financially to have both coverages in the event this was to happen near you.
Okay, Matt, thank you so much for answering those questions. We know some people will want to know about other information, resources available. We have more information on our website. That's 3newsnow.com.